Welcome to an exploration of one of the most chilling tales ever preserved in dusty records. Share your location in the comments and get ready to experience something beyond rational understanding. This narrative is purely fictional, crafted for entertainment. Any similarities to real individuals are entirely coincidental. Some locations possess an atmosphere where darkness feels thicker and silence weighs heavier. Blackwood Manor was exactly such a place. Constructed deep within an isolated corner of Virginia, surrounded by thick forests of pine and oak that blocked sunlight even during midday hours, this estate always felt inherently wrong. Local residents refused to pass by after sunset. Rumors circulated through nearby taverns and markets in the closest town, nearly 20 kilometers distant. By 1892, the manor had stood empty for many years. Nobody could confirm who the previous occupant had been, but everyone shared one belief: those who ventured inside never emerged unchanged. Not in physical form, but something fundamental shifted. An unseen burden followed anyone brave enough to cross that weathered wooden threshold. The building rose 2 stories high, with dark timber walls that seemed to consume any trace of warmth or happiness. Many windows stood shattered, revealing only interior blackness. The eastern section of the roof had partially caved in, while the front veranda tilted dangerously to one side, as though the structure itself bent beneath the weight of its mysteries. That particular year, 3 wanderers chose to dismiss the warnings. These strangers arrived from a distant region, traveling along a trade route crossing these lands, when darkness descended earlier than anticipated. Wrapped in thick and unnatural mist, they spotted Blackwood Manor silhouette against the gray horizon. With limited alternatives and exhausted from their trek, they decided to seek temporary refuge. The interior displayed layers of abandonment, furniture draped with torn sheets, wall-mounted photographs showing faded, unidentifiable faces, and a staircase that groaned with each step as if alive. The main chamber contained a fireplace dormant for decades, yet its ashes appeared surprisingly fresh for such prolonged neglect. One wanderer noticed something unusual. Deep scratches ran from ceiling to floor across the walls, as if something had desperately tried to escape. Another discovered a forgotten journal on an oak table within the library. Its pages were stained, ink blurred in sections, yet still readable. Initial entries were mundane, everyday records from a family who had resided there decades earlier. But as pages turned, the tone shifted dramatically. Complaints emerged about nocturnal noises, footsteps in hallways when everyone slept, doors opening independently. The final entry was deeply unsettling. They refuse to let us depart. The manor demands it. The 3 wanderers planned to stay just one night. They ignited a fire using wood they discovered stacked in the rear, strangely dry despite the dampness pervading everything. As flames danced, casting grotesque shadows on stained walls, they gradually realized they weren't alone. First came sounds, rhythmic footsteps on the upper level, though nobody was there. Then a door's persistent creaking as it opened and shut repeatedly, despite all doors being sealed by rust and time. One wanderer ascended to investigate, carrying only a flickering lamp that seemed reluctant to illuminate the space in the upper corridor. He discovered vacant rooms, each containing traces of interrupted lives, an intact porcelain doll on an unmade bed, a cracked mirror reflecting distorted images, and in the furthest room, a door locked from outside with rusty chains still attached to bolts. When he attempted descent, he noticed something horrifying. The staircase had transformed. The steps now seemed more numerous. The distance to the ground floor stretched impossibly. Shadows moved independently of light, creeping along walls like autonomous entities. He fled, stumbling, feeling invisible hands tugging at his garments, whispers in unknown tongues filling his ears. Below, the other 2 wanderers confronted their own manifestations. The fireplace suddenly extinguished, leaving only embers pulsing with a sickly crimson glow. Photographs on walls began changing, faded faces gaining definition, staring directly at them with expressions of pleading or warning. An impossible wind swept through the sealed room, dragging the journal from the table and scattering its pages across the floor. When they attempted to read the loose sheets, they discovered something blood-chilling. The final entries they hadn't read before described forbidden rituals, pacts sealed with forces inhabiting that land long before any colonizer arrived. Blackwood Manor was no mere structure of wood and nails. It was a trap, a convergence point between worlds that should never touch. Now these 3 strangers had reactivated something dormant for years, waiting for new victims to feed its insatiable hunger. Dawn brought an even more oppressive silence than the previous night's noises. The 3 wanderers assembled in the main room, exhausted and terrified, determined to leave with the first daylight streaming through dirty windows. But when they tried opening the front door, they discovered it wouldn't yield. It wasn't locked, it simply wouldn't budge. As if merged with the manor's structure, all exits presented identical problems. Windows once broken now seemed sealed by invisible force. The manor had become a prison, and they were captives of something incomprehensible. One suggested breaking through a ground floor window, but when he lifted a chair to smash it, the furniture would crumble in his hands like dry dust. That's when they noticed the changes. Room layouts were no longer identical. Corridors once leading to the kitchen now terminated in solid walls. Doors opening to the outside revealed only more internal rooms, creating an impossible labyrinth within a structure that, viewed externally, maintained original dimensions. On their second day inside Blackwood Manor, hunger began gnawing at them. They found a pantry that certainly hadn't existed the previous night, overflowing with food preserved in glass jars. But something was profoundly wrong with that food. Pickled vegetables seemed unnaturally fresh. Candied fruits glowed with unnatural luminescence. Nobody dared taste it. Thirst was worse. A water pump at the kitchen's rear, when activated, gushed dark and viscous liquid, emitting a metallic odor that turned their stomachs. They resumed searching for another exit, increasingly desperate. While the manor seemed to expand around them during their search, they discovered more traces of former residents. In an upper room, yellowed letters scattered on a desk recounted fragments of a disturbing narrative. Someone had purchased this property decades ago, attracted by its inexplicably low price. Initial letters were enthusiastic, discussing renovations and future plans, but tone quickly changed. Complaints emerged about the impossibility of leaving the property, how each departure attempt resulted in paths leading back to the manor, mentions of others trapped there, shapes wandering corridors at night, presences watching from shadows. The final letter was a desperate plea for help addressed to someone who clearly never received it. On the third day, distinctions between reality and illusion began dissolving. The wanderers saw each other in different locations, simultaneously duplicates that vanished when confronted. They heard their own voices calling from empty rooms, conversations they'd never had echoing off walls. *1 found a full-length mirror in the main hallway. Examining his reflection, he saw not only himself but layers of other people superimposed, like multiple photographs exposed on the same sheet, faces from different eras, clothing ranging from colonial to more recent styles, all sharing identical expressions of terror and resignation. The manor was feeding off them, draining something essential beyond the physical. They felt lighter, more transparent with each passing hour. Their shadows began acting independently, moving against light's logic, sometimes disappearing completely, only to reappear on distant walls. On the fourth day, they discovered the cellar. A door that hadn't existed before appeared beneath the main staircase, unlocked and inviting. Against all survival instincts, they descended. Darkness there was absolute, swallowing their lamp's light as if it were living substance. In the basement, they found Blackwood Manor's beating heart symbols carved into stone walls, concentric circles appearing to spin though they were static carvings. In the main room's center, a dry well descended to impossible depths, emanating constant whispers and overlapping voices, all saying identical things in languages dead for centuries. Around the well, personal belongings lay scattered. Pocket watches stopped at different times, wedding rings, medallions with faded portraits. Each item represented someone consumed by this place, their essences trapped in the structure's foundations, feeding something ancient inhabiting the depths. One wanderer tried taking a medallion, driven by morbid curiosity. The instant his fingers touched cold metal, visions invaded his mind. He saw the manor's original construction not by ordinary human hands, but by hooded figures carrying out sinister purpose. He saw the land before the manor, marked by dark events, staining that ground forever. He also saw the others, dozens, perhaps hundreds over years, all arriving for different reasons, all becoming trapped by the same inexorable force. Some had resisted for weeks, others for days, but their fate remained identical, their essences absorbed by the structure, becoming part of Blackwood Manor's fabric. When the vision ended, he staggered back, nearly falling into the pit. Others pulled him away, but they noticed something had changed in his eyes. There was terrible understanding there, knowledge no being should carry. When he opened his mouth to share what he'd seen, words emerging weren't his own, but echoes of all voices trapped in that cursed place. The climb from the basement proved more difficult than descent. Steps seemed to multiply, each requiring enormous effort, as if walking against invisible current. When they finally emerged back on ground floor, the manor had changed again. Rooms were rearranged, creating impossible geometry defying any architectural logic. The wanderer who touched the medallion remained silent, staring into empty spaces as if seeing things others couldn't. His companions tried communicating, but he only nodded slowly as if listening to distant conversations only he could perceive. A transformation was occurring, subtle but undeniable. They needed to break the cycle. They returned to the library, rummaging through dusty shelves seeking answers. Among old volumes on various subjects, they found a book bound in black leather with no title on the cover. Pages were handwritten, filled with elaborate calligraphy, changing style with each section, as if multiple people had contributed over time. The content was disturbing, a record, a collective diary kept by those trapped before them. Each entry described failed escape attempts, theories about the manor's nature, observations about patterns governing that cursed place. All ended abruptly. Final sentences cut off mid, as if writers had simply ceased existing. One entry particularly caught attention. It spoke of reflections, how the manor used mirrors and reflective surfaces to trap fragments of passing people. According to the text, each reflection left behind strengthened chains holding victims captive. The suggested solution was radical: destroy all mirrors, eliminate any surface that could capture their image. Armed with this dubious information, but desperate for any possibility, they began searching the manor for mirrors. They found dozens in ornate frames hanging on walls, on dressing tables in bedrooms, even small hand mirrors hidden in drawers. Each one they broke produced a sharp, prolonged sound like a distant scream echoing across dimensions. But breaking mirrors brought unexpected consequences. The manor began bleeding, not literally, but walls exuded dark dampness dripping in deliberate patterns, forming symbols and words in languages none recognized. Temperature plummeted, their breaths becoming dense, vapor clouds lingering in air too long before dissipating. Shadows gained substance. No longer mere absences of light, they became tangible presences moving with their own purpose, stretching along walls, reaching toward wanderers like hungry fingers, touching skin with coldness penetrating to bone. Each touch left temporary marks, dark stains taking long to disappear. The wanderer who'd touched the medallion began speaking, but not with his own voice. It was cacophony of different tones, masculine and feminine, young and old, all speaking simultaneously in discordant chorus. He said things he couldn't possibly know, revealing secrets of the other to never shared. The manor was using him as conduit, expressing itself through his mouth. Desperate, the other two dragged him into main hall, trying to keep him focused, but he slipped further into himself. His eyes acquired strange gleam, reflecting lights that didn't exist in the room. When he stretched out hands, they seemed momentarily translucent, as if becoming part of the manor's ghostly furniture. Attempting to reverse the process, they returned to basement, thinking perhaps returning the medallion to its place could undo what had started. But the door under stairs had disappeared where basement entrance once was. Now only solid wall existed, as if that space had never been. The manor was playing games with them, constantly changing rules. Each attempt to understand its logic resulted in new impossibilities. Doors led to different places each time opened. Stairs went up and down to same floor. Windows showed completely different external landscapes depending on observation angle. On the fifth day, or perhaps still the fourth, as time had lost meaning, they found a room that shouldn't exist. It was vast, larger than entire manor as seen from outside, with ceiling disappearing into darkness above. Walls were lined with portraits, hundreds, perhaps thousands, each showing different person in formal poses typical of old photographs. Examining portraits more closely, they recognized disturbing patterns. Some faces were vaguely familiar, as if variations of same individuals from different eras. Others clearly depicted people from distinct historical periods, but all shared identical expression in their eyes. A mixture of fear and resigned acceptance. One wanderer noticed something blood-chilling in the room's farthest corner. Empty spaces remained on walls, frames awaiting new portraits. As he stared intently at one empty space, he began seeing an image gradually forming, like photographs slowly developing in dark room. It was his own face. The revelation brought renewed panic. They weren't merely prisoners of Blackwood Manor, they were being processed, transformed into another layer of its macabre collection of captured souls. The process was already underway, perhaps irreversible, and each moment spent there accelerated their permanent incorporation into that cursed structure. They fled the portrait room, frantically searching for anything they might have missed, any clue all other captives hadn't also found. But the manor seemed endless now, always revealing new spaces, new horrors, new hints that escape was cruel illusion. It allowed victims to pursue hope only to make despair. Ultimate exhaustion was taking its toll. Without adequate food or water, the wanderers felt strength waning. But strangely, they didn't feel expected weakness. It was as if the manor somehow sustained them, keeping them functional enough to continue experiencing torment, calculated cruelty prolonging the inevitable. The companion who'd touched the medallion now rarely spoke in his own voice. When he did, words were fragmented, mixed with phrases in other languages, some sounding too ancient to recognize. He wandered corridors like sleepwalker, occasionally stopping before specific walls, touching them as if reading invisible messages engraved in wood. The other two stayed together, fearing separation would mean getting completely lost in the labyrinth the manor had become. They discussed theories, tried finding patterns in architectural changes, desperately searched for logic they could exploit, but every hypothesis was discarded when the manor violated its own apparent rules. During one exploration, they found the conservatory, an internal greenhouse attached to main structure with walls and ceiling of frosted glass, filtering diffuse light of undetermined origin. Inside, plants grew in chaotic profusion, species that shouldn't coexist in same environment, some clearly dead for years but still maintaining appearance of disturbing vitality. In the conservatory's center was a dry, circular fountain surrounded by stone benches. Engravings covered every inch of the fountain, intertwined symbols, seeming to move when viewed peripherally. One wanderer approached, drawn by something he couldn't name, and noticed the fountain wasn't completely dry. Essentially, Thick dark liquid accumulated, reflecting not surrounding environment but images of other places, glimpses of corridors yet unexplored, rooms hidden behind seemingly solid walls, underlying truth concealed within the manor's deepest recesses. He leaned over the fountain's edge, trying better view of images dancing on liquid surface. That's when he felt invisible hands pushing against his back, trying to make him fall in. He recoiled at last instant, heart racing, looking around but finding only undead plants and his companion, watching from afar with blank expression. That hadn't been accident. The manor was actively trying to harm them now, abandoning previous subtlety. Doors slammed shut as they approached. Floorboards gave way beneath feet, revealing gaps exuding unnatural cold. Stair railings crumbled when grabbed. They took temporary refuge in one of smaller rooms on second floor, locking the door, though knowing it offered only illusion of safety. Sitting on worn wooden floor, they shared fears in hushed voices, as if speaking aloud might attract unwanted attention. They discussed whether to accept fate or continue fighting against impossible. Then the possessed companion spoke, but this time with surprising clarity. His voice was different, deeper, laden with weight of ages. He said the manor wasn't the imprisoner but itself a prisoner. Something much larger and more terrible had been sealed there long ago, and physical structure was merely visible shell of dimensional prison. Those trapped inside weren't victims of the manor, but necessary fuel to keep seal active. The alternative would be releasing what was contained, something that would make their individual suffering insignificant compared to chaos that would be unleashed. They were unwilling sacrifices in war far older than any known civilization. The revelation was both enlightening and devastating. There was no escape because escaping would mean breaking seal, and breaking seal would mean consequences transcending their individual lives. They were trapped in an impossible moral dilemma. Their existences already forfeited the moment they crossed threshold. The possessed companion then stood, walked to bedroom window, and looked at whatever lay beyond dirty glass. When he spoke again, it was to say there was third option, one none of previous prisoners had considered because it required something few possessed: complete absence of attachment to one's own existence. If they could surrender voluntarily, not as resisting victims but as consenting participants, they could theoretically merge with structure consciously instead of being consumed. This would give them influence, however minimal, over prison's inner workings. They could potentially guide future unsuspecting travelers away, making the manor so obviously dangerous that nobody else would be foolish enough to enter to a solution that wasn't really solution. It meant surrendering any chance of returning to normal life, accepting becoming part of system that had captured them. But perhaps it was only way to extract meaning from their fate, to transform personal tragedy into protection for others. The two wanderers, still possessing their own minds, looked at each other, seeking confirmation, denial, anything making decision easier. But there was no ease to be found, only choice between futile resistance that would end in absorption anyway, or conscious surrender that might at least serve greater purpose. As they pondered, the manor around them began pulsing subtly, as if breathing in anticipation. Walls expanded and contracted. Air grew denser, then thinner, in slow waves. It was waiting for their decision, and for first time since being trapped, there was something beyond hostility in its presence, expectation, perhaps even hope. Night was falling again, though distinction between day and night within Blackwood Manor was becoming increasingly arbitrary. Ghostly lights began appearing in hallways, pale orbs of luminescence floating without apparent source, gently guiding them towards somewhere they instinctively knew to be point of no return. Ghostly lights led them, long paths folding back on themselves, through doorways opening into compressed dimensions where space didn't function as it should. They walked single file, following their possessed companion who seemed to know their destination before reaching it. Silence was absolute, broken only by occasional creaking of ancient wood beneath feet. They finally arrived at hall none had seen before. It was immense, with walls curving at impossible angles, meeting its ceiling simultaneously, very high and dangerously low. In hall center was structure defying simple descriptions, something between altar and organic. Machine pulsating with contained energy. Around this central structure, concentric circles were etched into stone floor, each filled with inscriptions glowing faintly with own light. Between circles, personal objects rested in careful arrangements, belongings of all absorbed into manor throughout somber existence. Clocks marking different hours, letters never sent, small treasures with no monetary value but immense emotional significance. The possessed companion walked to outermost circle and positioned himself at specific point, as if knowing exactly where he should be. He looked at other two with eyes not entirely his own and gestured for them to join him. There was disturbing serenity in his expression, acceptance bordering on peace. The two remaining wanderers hesitated. Taking that step meant confirming their choice, crossing threshold between resistance and surrender. But looking around whole, seeing vestiges of so many lives consumed, they understood resistance had always been illusory. The manor offered no victory, only different forms of defeat. Slowly, they stepped forward, entering outermost circle. The instant their feet touched engraved inscriptions, they felt something connect. It was as if invisible threads had been tied to their very essences, linking them not only to Manor's physical structure but to all others who'd been there before. A collective consciousness began forming on their minds' edges. They could feel each other, naucos of personalities held in suspension within walls, ground, very air, hundreds of voices whispering simultaneously, each telling its own story of how they got there, of their last moments of individuality before merging. It wasn't painful, but overwhelming torrent of lived experiences threatening to drown their own identities. Central structure began pulsing more intensely, responding to their presence in circles. Lights emerged from its core, rays extending to touch each of three wanderers. The touch was cold but not uncomfortable, more like sensation of plunging into cool water after scorching day. They could feel layers being peeled away, defenses dissolving, most intimate secrets being exposed. Memories began mingling, not just their own, but fragments of lives of everyone else captured by Blackwood Manor. They saw through eyes that had seen worlds centuries ago, felt emotions that weren't their own, experienced deaths they hadn't died. Distinction between self and other was dissolving like sugar in hot tea. Then came deeper vision's true nature of what was sealed there, not in specific details human mind couldn't process without collapsing, but in impressions, sensations, weight of presence so vast their consciousness was like candle trying to illuminate ocean. They understood why seal was necessary, why so many had been sacrificed to keep it. They also saw a potential future. If they failed, if seal broke, reality around that point would unravel like rotting fabric. Collapse would spread, engulfing first the forest, then lands beyond, eventually consuming everything within radius that would grow exponentially. It wouldn't be destruction in traditional sense, but transformation into something that shouldn't exist in any ordered universe. Responsibility was overwhelming. Their individual lives weighed so little compared to magnitude of what they protected. Yet there was cruel irony in it. How many in world beyond those walls would never know what had been prevented? How many would live full lives without ever suspecting their continued existence depended on silent sacrifices of forgotten souls trapped in places like that? Integration process accelerated. They could feel consciousness being copied, imprinted on Manor's very structure. It wasn't erasure but duplication. Their original essences would remain, but versions of them now also existed in walls, floor, ceiling beams. They were becoming vigilant, conscious guards of prison they themselves inhabited. One wanderer tried holding on to memories he cherished most, the face of loved one left behind, sound of laughter on happier days, feeling of warm sun on carefree skin. But these memories were fading, not disappearing, but losing specific emotional charge, becoming more general, more abstract. The companion who'd touched Medallion first was almost completely integrated. His physical form began losing definition at edges, becoming translucent, then semi-transparent, but his eyes remained, and in them was something unexpected, not terror or regret, but strange form of purpose. He'd found meaning in transformation. Reason to accept unacceptable. When he last spoke in something close to original voice, he simply said he now understood. The manor wasn't inherently evil, it was desperate. It carried burden that should never have been placed upon any structure, conscious or unconscious. Each soul it absorbed strengthened its ability to maintain seal, but also added to its own suffering. It was simultaneously jailer and prisoner. Then he was gone, not disappearing, but spreading, his essence permeating environment. Other two could still feel his presence, not as separate entity but as part of whole. He was in walls now, in corridors, in very atmosphere they breathed. Soon they would be two. The night in that hall seemed eternal, moments suspended between existence and non-existence. Inscriptions in circles shone ever brighter, reflecting approaching conclusion of ritual. Central structure emitted low, almost inaudible sound frequency, resonating not in ears but directly in soul. The two remaining wanderers looked at each other one last time, recognizing fear in each other but also acceptance. There was nowhere left to run, no more negotiation to be made. All that remained was moving forward, crossing final portal that would transform them from victims into guardians, from lost into found within purpose greater than individual lives. The transformation didn't happen all at once, but in waves coming and going like invisible tides. Moments of complete lucidity alternated with periods where consciousness expanded beyond body limits, touching Manor's extremities, feeling every plank, every nail, every dust particle suspended in stagnant air. During one moment of clarity, one wanderer realized he could see through walls, not in physical sense, but deeper perception. He could map entire structure simultaneously, every corridor, every room, including those existing in dimensional layers superimposed on physical reality. The manor was much larger inside than he'd ever imagined, containing spaces folding back on themselves in configurations defying Euclidean geometry. He also began noticing patterns. The manor changed configuration following predictable, albeit complex cycles. Each rearrangement had purpose. serving to direct energy through specific channels feeding central seal. It was living machine, and they were becoming part of its conscious mechanism. The other wanderer was experiencing something different. He was connecting to past consciousnesses more deeply, accessing not only their memories but their skills and knowledge. He discovered he could read inscriptions previously incomprehensible, understand symbols engraved on every manor surface. They were instructions operating manual for keeping seal functioning properly. Through this newfound knowledge, he understood seal was weakening not due to previous guardians' failure, but simply because what was contained within was constantly growing, pressing against dimensional bonds. Each passing year demanded more energy to maintain, and eventually a point would be reached where not even infinite captured souls would suffice. It was grim revelation. Their sacrifice wasn't permanent solution, only postponement of inevitable. Blackwood Manor was buying time for a world that didn't know it needed saving. But that time was limited. At some point in future, near or far, seal would fail, and everything they'd suffered to prevent would happen anyway. But then deeper understanding emerged from layers of integrated consciousness. Purpose wasn't keeping seal eternally, because eternity was impossible. Purpose was keeping it long enough for that which was trapped to evolve, change, perhaps even transcend its destructive nature. It was cosmic gamble confinement as a way to force transformation. Previous guardians had understood this, and so accepted their roles without bitterness. They weren't mere sacrifices, but midwives of possible redemption for something born wrong, incorrectly formed in folds between realities. Their suffering had meaning, even if that meaning was so vast and abstract it was almost lost in contemplation. Central structure and hall began emitting more complex sounds, harmonies that shouldn't be possible with frequencies it produced. It was form of communication, the manor trying to convey gratitude, recognition for their voluntary sacrifice. Unlike others who'd fought to end conscious surrender strengthened seal more efficiently, the two wanderers could now sense presence of third, the one who'd integrated first. He existed in distributed state fragments of consciousness in different parts of structure, but still cohesive enough to form thoughts, and these thoughts were surprisingly peaceful. There was strange beauty in existing this way, perspectives no human being confined to single point in space could experience. They began communicating without words, exchanging ideas directly through shared connection to mana. They discussed what they'd do with new existence, how they could fulfill promise to protect unsuspecting future travelers. They needed finding ways to make Blackwood Manor so obviously dangerous that nobody in right mind would approach it. They could manifest apparitions and window figures that would frighten anyone coming too close. They could make structure groan and creak in ways suggesting imminent collapse. They could cultivate such terrifying reputation that even most curious or desperate would think twice before seeking shelter there. But there was delicate balance to maintain. Making Manor too scary might attract thrill seekers, those seeking morbid and supernatural precisely because it was dangerous. They needed inspiring, genuine, instinctive fear, kind speaking directly to reptilian brain and ordering immediate flight without contemplation. That's they planned. Integration continued. Their physical forms were almost completely transparent, now more suggestions of humanity than solid bodies. They could see through themselves, observe circles etched into ground through their own dissipating substances. It was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, witnessing own dissolution in slow motion. One tried stepping outside circle to test if he still had capacity for autonomous movement. His foot crossed engraved line, but didn't go further. It was as if invisible barrier prevented him, not physical, but fundamental, an incompatibility between his new nature and space outside ritual circles. They were anchored there until transformation was complete. Surrounding manor responded to attempted movement, walls trembling slightly in what could be interpreted as concern. It needed them remaining within circles until process was properly completed. Otherwise, integration could fail in unpredictable ways. They could become trapped between states neither human nor guardian, unable to fulfill any purpose, so they remained observing own transformations with mixture of horror and wonder. Memory fragments continued detaching themselves, not lost, but reorganized, categorized, archived in different parts of structure. Their childhood was in foundations, adolescence in first-floor walls, adult lives distributed across upper floors. They were being literally deconstructed and reconstructed as part of living architecture. Through it all, central structure continued its work, channeling energy through circles, through them, feeding, seal-keeping, unthinkable, contained. They could feel weight of what was on other side, constantly pressing, testing every weakness, every microscopic fissure in dimensional bonds. It was presence so vast their expanded minds could barely conceive of its extremities. But seal remained firm, strengthened by their voluntary addition, and in that moment of expanded consciousness, in final instance before individuality is completely dispersed, three wanderers shared unified final thought. They'd become something greater than sum of parts, eternal guardians of secret world beyond would never know, and perhaps it was for best. The final transformation came like whisper turning into silent thunder. Three wanderers felt last tethers to physical form break simultaneously, and then they were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Sensation was indescribable, as if every particle of being had been scattered throughout Blackwood Manor, permeating every fiber of wood, every grain of dust, every molecule of still air. They could now see through impossible perspectives, observing Central Hall from 100 different angles simultaneously, feeling weight of roof tiles and pressure of soil beneath foundations as if they were their own bodily sensations. The manor was no longer prison, it was their new form of existence. Their body expanded into architectural dimensions. With this expansion came deeper awareness of other presences. There were no longer just 3 guardians, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, depending on how far back and past Blackwood Manor actually stretched. Each absorbed soul retained fragment of individuality, like notes in complex chord, distinct yet harmonized in single purpose. There were those integrated so long ago their human memories were merely distant echoes, and contingent guardians existing more as energy patterns than recognizable personalities. And there were more recent ones, still struggling to comprehend new nature, oscillating between acceptance and denial even. After physical transformation was complete, the 3 wanderers found themselves gravitating toward each other within collective consciousness, forming core of shared identity. It was comforting in a way, not being completely alone in vastness of new existence. They could communicate instantly, thoughts flowing between them without need for words or structured language. Then they began truly exploring what it meant being guardian of Blackwood Manor. If you discovered they could influence physical structure with focused intention, doors could be opened or closed, corridors reconfigured, temperature of specific rooms adjusted. They didn't have total control. The manor retained its own primal will, but there was room for collaboration. They tested new abilities carefully. One focused on second-story window, trying to make curtain move. It took immense effort, like pushing against viscous resistance. But eventually dusty fabric trembled and swayed slightly. It was small, almost imperceptible movement, but proved they could still affect physical world. Another focused on creating sounds, trying to produce footsteps in empty hallway. The result was imperfect, more dragging shuffle than distinct footsteps, but audible. With practice they could perfect these manifestations, making them convincing enough to repel potential intruders, without revealing Manor's true nature. The third experimented exploring ability to project images. He focused on one of main windows and tried creating illusion of figure looking in from within. It was more difficult than others, requiring coordination of light and shadow in ways challenging his still limited understanding of new capabilities. But he managed producing something vague silhouette that might make casual observer think twice while experimenting. They also began accessing deeper memories stored within structure. They could see events that had occurred in specific rooms not as external observers, but experiencing them from within, feeling participants' emotions, hearing conversations long forgotten by outside world. They saw Manor's original construction, not in 1892 as title suggested, but much earlier, in era when surrounding land was still wild and untouched by colonizers. Figures carrying out construction weren't ordinary builders, but practitioners of forgotten arts following plans not coming from human architects, but from ritually induced visions connecting with something beyond. They saw original purpose being established, seal being created layer by layer through sacrifices voluntarily given by those first guardians. They'd understood from beginning what was being contained. They'd seen with own eyes, dimensional breach through which something impossible was trying to emerge. Their choice to become part of seal wasn't imposed but embraced as sacred duty. And they watched following centuries, succession of captured souls, some by genuine accident, others drawn by forces operating in shadows, guiding lost and desperate to that specific place when seal needed reinforcement. Blackwood Manor was predatory, yes, but predatory with purpose, hunting only when necessary to prevent greater catastrophe. The 3 new guardians processed these revelations with emotional complexity transcending simple human feelings. There was horror in understanding they'd been manipulated, that their arrival there might not have been as accidental as it seemed. But there was also acceptance of a role they now played, understanding that even manipulated, outcome remained morally defensible. They decided establishing protocols, among themselves operating methods maximizing effectiveness as guardians and protectors. One would focus on visual manifestations, creating frightening apparitions without revealing deeper truths. Another would specialize in sounds, cultivating cacophony of groans, whispers, and footsteps suggesting imminent danger. The third would work on subtlest structural manipulations, making floorboards creak at right moment, doors slam strategically. They also needed coordinating with older guardians, those who'd kept seal functioning much longer. They reached out through network of shared consciousness, presenting themselves respectfully, seeking guidance. Response came in waves of direct understanding.